Good morning, Griffins. I hope you enjoyed that little jingle there. Hope you're having a great Tuesday and that things are going well for you. I got a lot of notes today, so that's the main goal for today. Is we're going to try and cruise through these. We're at the end of the unit, so I'll send you guys the test. Do that through Moodle. It'll be open note. I'm probably going to go in today and edit some of it. Try and make it as easy as possible for your guys' sake. But we'll deal with that tomorrow. Or possibly Thursday. I might use tomorrow as a study day and then give you the test on Thursday. But yeah, after that, we'll be into the last unit where we get into Jimmy Carter, Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton, and a little bit of George W. Bush. So that'll be the last unit over modern American history. Because we're already in the 70s, so yeah, we're getting to the point where we're in the last 50 years of history or so. The closer you to get to modern history, the harder it is to qualify things from a true historian's perspective. So that'll be the next unit coming up, but we'll deal with that when we get there. Cool. Let's jump over. Mrs. Davis this morning has sent you a little 3-minute retreat from Loyola Press, so go ahead and check that out. That should be cool. Today, just notes for you because it is a significant chunk of notes. So let's jump right in and get through these as quick as we can. Social change during the Nixon years. The American Indian movement, called AIM, they're wanting more autonomy for Indian tribes on reservations, and they just want fair treatment for Indians. As you know, through most of American history, Indians and Indian tribes are kind of getting the short end of the stick. We sign agreements with them, say, oh yeah, you can keep this land, and then, we come back 20 years later and say, actually, we need you to move because we found out there's oil here, sorry. So we had kind of breached a lot of agreements with Indian tribes, and they wanted a little more autonomy to run things how they saw fit on their own reservations, which nowadays they essentially can. Cesar Chavez, he's going to be a Latino-American activist that's out there looking for better treatment for Latino Americans. He saw that the civil rights movement worked for African Americans, and he felt that there was still a lot of ground to be gained for Hispanic Americans and fair treatment and fair pay for them. Feminists throughout the late 60s and early 70s are going to be demanding equal pay and fair treatment in the workforce, which they were not getting. And still, there's some unequal treatment for women in the workforce. Wounded Knee occurs in 1973. It was initially supposed to be a protest against the U.S. government constantly failing to follow up with the treaties that they signed with tribes, continuing to screw the Indian tribes over. But the Indians this go around kind of took a little bit of a more militaristic stance. They brought guns to this protest. So the U.S. Marshals responded, and it kind of became a standoff where eventually 2 Indians were killed, and a U.S. Marshal, it says he was killed in this text. Actually, that's not true. He was paralyzed. I should go in and fix that at some point. So the American Indian movement uses, Wounded Knee as this rallying cry to go, look again, here's 2 more Indians dead because of the U.S. government. And, this happened after the shootings at Kent State, where the National Guard had killed 4 American students at the University in Ohio. So just another situation where it seemed like maybe the government actually was an oppressive, government overstepping their bounds. Cesar Chavez, he's going to be an activist for Latino Americans. He wants better pay. He organizes unions for agricultural workers, and is a very prominent figure in the early 70s for the NFWA, which I believe is an agricultural union. I'd have to double check that, though. Feminism in the 60s, yeah, women take to the streets, and they want fair pay. They want equal treatment in the workforce. This was in the 60s, a time where you could be sexually harassed, and a woman wouldn't have any legal recourse, couldn't do anything about it. You just have to accept that that's the way the world is, and that sexism was okay in the workforce. Well, these women stand up and say, no, it's not okay. We need to change this. And their goal, with these protests where they burn bras here in the freedom trash can, was to try and get an amendment to the Constitution that would guarantee fair pay and fair treatment for women. This amendment kind of fails to get a lot of traction in Congress, but it's still floating around there, that it was eventually passed by Congress, but not enough of the states have ratified it to actually amend it to the Constitution. But a potential 28th Amendment there. It was opposed by groups of not really anti-feminists, but more conservative activists like Phyllis Schlafly. She's an opponent of Roe v. Wade, which is fine, but she also says something that's quite controversial. Even in the 70s, she said, the role of women is to stay home and raise children. Women don't belong in the workforce. And people were like, whoa, pump the brakes here, lady. That's controversial. Women, contribute a whole lot to our economy, to everything the United States does. So it's kind of disingenuous to pretend that women belong in the house when you can't discount the amazing things that amazing women have offered to America. I mean, I think even, Francis Crick and the other guy who discovered DNA, they based all their work on a woman scientist who then they didn't credit. This is what the feminists were talking about. They're like, there are women, contributing the same things that men are doing, but they're not getting fair pay or recognition. So Phyllis Schlafly is a controversial figure, but she does oppose Roe v. Wade, and since she has some traction in the news and in media, she gets a lot of protest organized against Roe v. Wade, which is, that's a more normal American view, that people would oppose Roe v. Wade, whereas thinking women belong in the house, in the kitchen, that's not a viewpoint a lot of Americans share. In 1972, Nixon's been president for 4 years. He needs to run for re-election, and Republicans still have the edge. The Democrats can't really figure out who they are as a party, and they're going to struggle greatly against Nixon. His economy is going well, and he continued to scale back our involvement in Vietnam. With this 72 election, he promised that the end was near and that he would stop the draft. McGovern campaigns on immediately withdrawing from Vietnam, which was popular, but otherwise didn't have many much popularity going into this election. You can see Nixon absolutely crushes him on the electoral map, where, yeah, McGovern only wins, Massachusetts and Washington, D.C. Nixon wins everything else. Faithless elector voted for Hospers here in Virginia. But other than that, Nixon absolutely crushes McGovern. He wins 60% of the popular vote, that's a lot. The end of the Vietnam War, just like Nixon said, would come shortly after that election. We would fully withdraw in 1973, and it turns out that South Vietnam wouldn't last much longer without us. We tried to send money and guns over for them to continue their fight, but they would fall to the communist North Vietnam, and it would be unified as a communist state in 1975. So we leave 2 years later. No more South Vietnam. Saigon's renamed Ho Chi Minh City. Vietnam is still a unified state. It's technically communist as a political entity, but much like China, they have free market enterprise. They open up to capitalism in the 80s because they realize they can make a lot of money on the supply side of economics. So yeah, a lot of goods, clothing, especially shoes. I think Nike, a lot of their factories are in Vietnam, because they don't have to pay the workers as much there. Refugees fleeing South Vietnam. Yeah, a lot of these people realize with the communists taking over in South Vietnam, they're going to start killing off the people associated with the South Vietnamese government and with the South Vietnamese army. So a lot of them are evacuated by American soldiers leaving in 73, and even more after that attempt to leave the country, because they realize that with the communists taking over, there's going to be some people dying. So here's a kind of a famous photograph here. You can see this guy once in the plane. I can't tell if this guy's like fist fighting this man or if he's trying to like grab his shirt collar and yank him in. Yeah, it's kind of hard to tell. It looks like he's trying to help him in, but I don't really know. See the expression on this guy's face. This was a rough thing for Vietnamese families that wanted out. But as you know, there's a lot of Vietnamese people living in America currently. Most of the Vietnamese families living in America came over right there in the mid-70s as the Vietnam War was failing and South Vietnam was losing. Nixon's got a policy. He says, all this Cold War fighting is screwing things up. We could make a lot of money together, Soviet Russia. China, we could make a lot of money together if we just get over the fact that you're communist and we're not. So Nixon decides he's going to go over to Soviet Russia. That's risky. They could just assassinate you, Nixon. But they don't, because the Soviets are actually quite impressed with Nixon. He's a very skilled diplomat. He's a great negotiator, and he's pretty persuasive. So the new Soviet leader Brezhnev is actually kind of open to easing the tension with the United States, or so we think. So détente's going to be our policy for most of the 70s, but the Cold War would ramp back up in the 80s again. So unfortunately, Nixon was that close to maybe ending the Cold War, but we just couldn't quite get over the hump. Brezhnev and the Soviets continued to expand communism throughout the world, and détente wouldn't last forever, but it had some promise here in the 70s. That's why Nixon, crushed this election. Was détente was kind of working. We signed the SALT Treaty, which reduced the amount of nuclear bombs. That's good. We don't need all these nukes lying around. So the US and the Soviets actually agree, let's get rid of some of our nukes. We decide, instead of racing each other in space, instead of, fighting and to try and prove who's best, why don't we work together? And then we could actually do some really, really cool stuff together, which we have since done, with the International Space Station, which is primarily made by the United States and Russia. We also reached some trade deals. We've got stuff they like, they've got stuff we like. So why not work together here? Open trade with China. Nixon travels to China. He's the first president to ever go to China. First sitting president to ever go to mainland China. He went over and he negotiated opening up trade, and China sees this as an opportunity to make money. We see it as an opportunity to make money. So we kind of got over the fact that they're communist and had been fighting, sponsoring a war against us in Vietnam. Like, hey, let's sweep that under the rug and make some money together. So Nixon's taking a very drastically different approach than all previous presidents who never would have done any of this. They've been very unwilling to even travel to those countries. So détente, we're going to work. Nixon's going to prove that he's a pretty skilled diplomat, he's a great negotiator, and he manages to sell communists on the idea that free enterprise could help them make money. You're like, free enterprise and communism? That's like oil and vinegar. Those things don't mix. Well, turns out they kind of can mix. But here's Nixon with Mao Zedong. Here's Nixon with Leonid Brezhnev, the new premier. He replaced Khrushchev, who, like previous American presidents, never would have agreed to any of this. So it seemed like the times are a-changing here, and maybe the Cold War could end. But it doesn't. Spoiler alert. Nixon starts propping up Israel more than any previous president. And that's because we here in the United States and the United Nations believe that Jews have the right to self-determination. As in, if people want to form a country and declare independence from a foreign country or fight for their independence, they have that right. People have the right of self-determination. We back Israel in the 6 Days War. This is right before Nixon takes over. And then after that, we continue to prop them up with money, weapons, and this is going to anger a lot of Muslim countries that don't think Jewish people have the right of self-determination. They feel that, Jews just showed up after World War II and occupied Palestine, where a bunch of Muslim people had been living for centuries. So the issue of Israel's self-determination has kind of put us at odds with some Muslim countries in the Middle East. But the United Nations has confirmed that Israel should exist, so it's not going anywhere anytime soon. Henry Kissinger, which was one of Nixon's, he was the Secretary of State, one of his most influential cabinet members, is himself a Jew who fled from Nazi Germany for fear of the Holocaust. So Kissinger absolutely, he loves that there's an Israel, that there's a country for Jewish people to protect Jewish people so that things like the Holocaust would never happen again. That Jews would have their own formalized military to protect themselves with. And most of that military, most of those military goods are made in America and sent to Israel. We also send them a lot of foreign aid money. And this relationship with Israel has continued to modern times. You can see Donald Trump here with Ben Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel. So yeah, we have a strong relationship with Israel. They're our most important ally in the Middle East, other than maybe Saudi Arabia. So our alliance with Israel does kind of weaken our relations with other countries. You can see on the chart here, if you look at Israel and go across and see their relations with other countries, you can see there's a lot of frowny faces here. Most of the Muslim countries, and especially these terrorist groups, like ISIS and Al-Qaeda, Israel doesn't get along with a lot of people, but hey, they get along with the United States. If you look at our chart here, you can see, yeah, we don't like Al-Qaeda. We're cool with Egypt, though. Thanks, Jimmy Carter. We'll talk about that later. We don't like Hamas. We don't like Hezbollah. We don't like Iran. Iraq, we're cool with because we've invaded them and replaced their government. Israel, we're cool with. Palestine, we don't really recognize them as a country. Saudi Arabia, we're very cool with, despite them having a lot of backwards policies. Like they still occasionally stone people to death in Saudi Arabia, but they got all that oil, so we'll overlook that. Syria, we got issues with them. Turkey, we got some issues with them. And so the U.S., we're great friends with Saudi Arabia and Israel. Those are our two strategic allies in the Middle East and have been since the days of Nixon. In the Middle East, it's all about politics and oil management. As in, these countries that have, lots and lots of oil, like Saudi Arabia has more oil than I believe any other country. We want to be friends with them because we want to trade with them. So, irrespective of their backwards social policies, we overlook that for free enterprise. Israel's our other ally seen here. Since détente means that we're going to ease relations, we're no longer going to contain communism, it does start spreading. In Latin America, that's kind of close to the United States. The CIA is like, well, instead of fighting open wars against them, why don't we just prop up fascist dictators or counterinsurgencies that'll fight communism on our behalf? And so we do just that. Places like Chile, where we sponsor Augusto Pinochet, who is like one of the worst dictators of all time. Probably he's probably worse than Adolf Hitler, which that's hard to say. But this dude, he would just load his citizens into a helicopter, fly them out in the ocean, throw them in the ocean. He was systematically killing anyone that didn't like him. And the U.S. propped him up because at least he's not communist. He, in fact, is willing to load communists into a plane and throw them into the ocean. Watergate is going to ruin Nixon's presidency. He forms this secret committee to reelect the president called the Creep, which tells you that that's not good. And he tells his aides in the Creep that they should go break into the Democratic National Committee. Go break into their office, steal a bunch of stuff, wiretap them. That way we'll have the edge on them going into the 72 election. America didn't find out about this until a year later. That's because when these guys got caught at Watergate, they tried to cover up the story, but alas, tape recordings would reveal Nixon himself, recordings of him talking about how he organized this scheme and wanted to burglarize the Watergate Hotel, break into it, and steal from the Democrats, and that he had also destroyed some of this evidence to make it look like he was never involved. The last thing he forgot to destroy was tape recordings of himself talking about committing these crimes. Whoopsie daisies, that's a big whoopsie daisies. So Nixon let his suspicions of George McGovern and get the best of him, which is weird because he absolutely crushed him. So I'm not sure why he was so nervous about that election. So they break into the Watergate Hotel, which still standing. Let's get a look at it. Yeah, here it is. The Watergate Hotel complex, seen here. So Nixon tells his aides to go break into a Democratic office here, steal from them, and that way him, as a Republican, he'd know what their speeches were going to be about, he'd know what their talking points for debates would be about, so he could absolutely crush them and look super impressive at the debates. Unfortunately, one of these aides left his wallet at the scene of the crime. That's not a good thing to leave at the scene of the crime. Your wallet, that people could use to identify you. That's a bad thing to leave. So they completely botched this attempt to break in. They left fingerprints everywhere. They were quite easily caught pretty well at the scene of the crime. The getaway driver who was supposed to get them away from the scene of the crime was actually eating in a restaurant in the lower floors of the Watergate. That's whoops. So Nixon comes out and tries to tell the American people, look, what I did, I'm not a crook, okay? Well, I did something, but I'm not a crook, okay? And that's something that someone who is definitely a crook would say. Nixon is going to resign because it's very clear he's going to be impeached, found guilty, and do jail time. He's organized a pretty serious crime here with burglary, destroying evidence. There's a lot of crimes there, abuse of power. He was going to be impeached and found guilty. So he says, you know what, America? You can't impeach me. You can't fire me because I quit. How about that? How about them apples? You can't fire me because I quit. He pulls that card and is replaced by his vice president, Gerald Ford. Gerald Ford pardons him so that he doesn't have to serve jail time and becomes the only president who was never elected as the president or the vice president. Strangely enough, Ford inherited the vice presidency from Spiro Agnew after he resigned because he was committing tax fraud. He was cheating on his taxes, so he quit the vice presidency. When that happens, the president gets to pick a new vice president. He picked the Speaker of the House, Gerald Ford. Then Nixon himself resigns, and Gerald Ford becomes the president, despite having never been elected as a vice president or president. That's the only time that's ever happened, and the only time it will ever happen again. That's ridiculously rare. So Ford tells America, look, I know you didn't choose me. None of you knew I'd have this responsibility. Even I didn't know I'd eventually become the president. But we're going to take time to heal, America. We need to put Watergate in the past, come together, and heal. And I, Gerald Ford, am going to be, your healing concoction, your health potion. So believe in me, people. That's the angle he tries to go with. That's the last in the notes there. So the end of Vietnam, Nixon's re-election, and then suspicion over him. Yeah, he committed some crimes here, and Nixon's fall from grace. That's the end of this unit. Jump over to the chat here. See what's going on. Hello, Katie. Yeah, in other news, I heard that, switch over to the screen here. I heard that, I think Pritzker yesterday announced that you can no longer fish on a boat with more than 2 people. So if you go out fishing, it just needs to be like you and your dad, or just by yourself, which would be harder for you guys because you can't drive. So that's something to look at for people who have been interested in fishing. Because I guess Pritzker felt people were going out on pontoon boats, like multiple families of people, like 12, 15 people were getting on boats. And so he said now he's limiting 2 people to a boat. That's it, no more than 2. So I thought that was kind of bogus, but personally I wouldn't be violating that law, so it didn't matter much to my personal fishing, but I felt like that could hurt some of you guys and your family who are going out and fishing together. All right. What's up, Nolan? What's up, Daniel? Smash like, sure. I mean, this channel's not monetized. You don't have to like this video. But, so if you're doing fishing, look into that. So you have 5 people on your boat. Well, yeah, that's what people on the internet were complaining about, was like, this is my family. I already live with them, so I'm not really practicing social distancing in my own home. If we ride in a car together, we're already, we're already not social distance. What's different about a boat than a car? So we can still drive to the store together, but now we can't get on a boat together unless it's just 2 people. It seemed like an odd overstep. I don't know that law is actually going to be enforceable because police still don't want to jack with you unless you're committing a real serious crime. A family out on a boat, they probably don't want to interact with you in case your family might have COVID and then they get it and spread it to their police their coworkers and maybe their family. So figure, I don't know if that's going to be enforceable because I don't know that the police would want to actually get out there and cruise up to your boat and get close to you. They probably would just close boat ramps down. So, yeah, it's a little update for you. But that's it for today. Guess thanks for joining, guys. I appreciate it. And I'll let you know what we're going to do as far as the test for this unit tomorrow. I'll probably push it back and we'll do the test Thursday. Then that would give me, let's see, 2 weeks and some change to get through the last unit, which will be pretty dicey, but we're going to go for it. But yeah, have a super duper Tuesday. It's super nice out today, so maybe get outside and enjoy the weather. Peace out.